Did you know that the war in Iran is part of the Greater Israel Project?
The Greater Israel Project?
The Greater Israel Project is God's covenant to Abraham, where God promised him and his descendants land from the Nile to the Euphrates River, including present-day Palestine, parts of Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq.
Is that why we're not visiting the Bible today?
That's right.
Where are we now?
We're on Hormuz Island, overlooking the Strait of Hormuz, Iran. This is where the world is watching every single move being made by Iran, Israel, and the United States. Here, we're witnessing the pages of biblical prophecy turning before our very eyes. God is moving on to the next phase of the Greater Israel Project with this war in Iran. At this very moment, we may be entering into the most consequential moment in human history.
And what does the war in Iran have to do with the Greater Israel Project?
This war is about eliminating its single greatest threat and obstacle.
I see.
That's why, on February 28, 2026, the United States and the State of Israel launched a missile attack, killing the supreme leader of Iran, along with top Iranian officials, in an effort to topple the Iranian regime and replace it with a government more friendly towards the US and the State of Israel, while creating further civil disruption and chaos within Iran.
You mean the intent was to cause internal chaos within Iran?
Precisely. A weakened government presents less of a threat to Israel and furthers Israel's ambition to control the Middle East.
And you're saying that this war in Iran is ultimately an attempt to create internal chaos so that Israel could expand its current borders in pursuit of the Greater Israel Project?
That's right. This is all part of Dad's divine intervention.
You do know that on the first day of the attack, a US Patriot missile destroyed an elementary school in Minab, Iran, and killed over 170 people, mostly school-aged Iranian girls. Was that part of God's plan?
I don't...
And as a result, Iran retaliated by attacking US bases in the GCC countries, restricted passage through the Strait of Hormuz, resulting in an energy crisis like never before, and cutting off roughly 30% of all the world's fertilizer supply. It's only been less than 2 months into the war. As of today, thousands of innocent civilians have died. I suppose this is all part of God's plan.
There's no doubt that all this is deeply disturbing. And I admit, I'm deeply saddened that innocent people must die. But let's not forget, Iran was developing nuclear weapons. The strike was necessary to prevent a further catastrophe.
I've been hearing something different. Narrator, are you there?
Why, yes, I am.
Is it true that Iran was on the verge of developing nuclear weapons? I've heard conflicting reports.
The truth is, when it comes to developing nuclear weapons, the answer is no. Iran was not anywhere close to producing weapons-grade uranium for use in a nuclear weapon. In fact, the late Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who held both the highest religious and political authority in Iran, making him more powerful than any elected official, repeatedly stated that nuclear weapons were forbidden under Islamic law. Although there is genuine scholarly debate about whether these statements constitute a formal binding fatwa in the technical religious sense, the statements themselves are thoroughly documented. As early as the day after the US invasion of Iraq in March 2003, Khamenei declared publicly, "We do not want an atomic bomb, and we are even against having chemical weapons. These issues do not agree with our principles."
And if you've been following the news, Joe Kent, the former director of the US National Counterterrorism Center, who resigned his position in protest over this war, confirmed precisely this. He stated publicly that Iran had a religious ruling against developing a nuclear weapon, and that no US intelligence information showed that ruling had been violated or lifted. He said directly that Iran was not on the verge of getting a nuclear weapon.
Then why am I hearing about this for the first time?
I suppose it all depends on where you get your news.
Whatever the case may be, there's no dispute that the Iranian government is comprised of Islamic fundamentalist fanatics who are out to destroy Israel and the United States. They openly declare death to America.
More on that slogan, and the 70-year history behind it, in future episodes. For now, it's important not to take it at face value without understanding the complex relationship between the US and Iran. What matters right now is understanding the Greater Israel Project itself. By studying its anatomy, we can begin to explain both past US foreign policy and where it may be headed.
So, narrator, what are the origins of the Greater Israel Project?
Genesis 15 verse 18, which states, "In that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates.
There it is. Black and white. Clear as day. Totally unambiguous.
So, based on this passage alone, the current Israeli government believes that God has authorized this unprovoked, preemptive attack against Iran.
What do you mean, unprovoked? We've been at war with Iran for 47 years.
The Iranian regime has been attacking Americans and spreading terror for 47 years.
Also, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, had wanted to take out Iran for 40 years. He understood the Iranian nuclear threat.
של ארצות הברית, את ידידי, נשיא ארצות הברית דונלד טראמפ, את צבא ארצות הברית, ושילוב הכוחות הזה מאפשר לנו לעשות את מה שאני מייחל לעשות כבר 40 שנה. להכות את משטר הטרור שוק על ירך. כך הבטחתי.
Unprovoked, meaning that days before the US-Israeli strike against Iran, Iran had offered to give up its entire uranium stockpile. This would have achieved more than the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, where Iran had agreed to dramatically reduce its uranium stockpile, limit enrichment levels, and allow international inspectors to monitor its facilities.
Iran agreed to do all that? Wow.
If I may interrupt, Genesis 15 is just one of many passages where God makes promises about land, and it may not mean what most people think it means.
What do you mean?
Let's start with the geography. Jesus, you said the Greater Israel project runs from the Nile to the Euphrates, but the word Nile never appears in Genesis 15.
Wait, so the river of Egypt isn't the Nile?
Correct. The Nile in Hebrew is always called Ye'or, a word of Egyptian origin used 57 times in the Bible, always referring to the Nile. Genesis 15:18 uses an entirely different word. The Bible's own authors knew the difference.
So the people invoking Genesis 15 to claim Egyptian territory are misreading the very verse their entire argument rests on.
Precisely. And that is just the beginning of the problem. There are multiple passages in the Bible where God promises different pieces of land at different times, and they don't agree with each other. Biblical scholar Rabbi Jacob Milgrom documented 7 distinct border maps across the Hebrew Bible. None of them identical. For example, Genesis 15 describes a territory from Wadi el-Arish to the Euphrates. The Book of Numbers, chapter 34, verses 1 through 12, describes a land notably smaller. And in the Book of Judges, chapter 20, verse 1, the Bible simply describes Israel as extending only from the city of Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, a strip of land roughly the size of New Jersey, with no Egyptian territory and no Iraqi territory.
So, which passage is correct?
Simply put, there is no consensus. And Milgrom noted one further point that all 7 maps agree on: the southern border has never varied. In every version, it runs through Wadi el-Arish, never the Nile.
Where in the Bible does God promise his people land, as currently envisioned by the Greater Israel Project?
That is the dilemma. Nowhere. The GIP's territorial ambitions exceed what even the most expansive biblical passage actually describes, when that passage is read correctly.
Interesting.
There is one more problem. One can argue that during the reign of Solomon, the kingdom of Israel did extend from the river of Egypt, Wadi el-Arish, to the Euphrates River, precisely the boundaries described in Genesis 15:18. The promise was made, and according to the Bible's own account, it was kept 3,000 years ago.
Wait, you're saying this prophecy has already been fulfilled?
That is what the text says. 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 21. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. The covenant God made with Abraham was fulfilled under Solomon. Using it to justify a modern territorial program treats as unfulfilled a promise the Bible itself records as having been kept.
So, the single biblical passage the Greater Israel Project rests on describes a border that isn't the Nile, describes a territory that was already fulfilled 3,000 years ago, and is one of 7 contradictory border maps, none of which match the GIP's current claims.
That is an accurate summary.
Narrator, with so many different interpretations and no consensus on which is correct, how did the Greater Israel Project become what it is today, claiming some sort of divine right over the entire Middle East?
This is where Zionism comes in.
Ah, yes, I've been hearing about Zionism.
Before we begin, it is important to note that criticizing the Israeli government, whose cabinet is filled with Zionists, is not the same as anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is hostility toward or discrimination against Jews as a religious, ethnic, or racial group. Criticism of Zionism is a critique of a political ideology and the means and methods by which the State of Israel pursues its goals. These are not the same thing.
Understood.
Zionism is a political ideology that advocates for a Jewish state in the historic region of Palestine. It emerged in late 19th century Europe as a Jewish nationalist response to anti-Semitism, founded by Theodor Herzl. Before 1948, there was no State of Israel. From the creation of Zionism in the late 19th century to the formation of Israel in 1948, the Zionist movement had been actively building institutions, settling land, and lobbying world powers. The State of Israel was the culmination of roughly 60 years of organized political work.
So how did Zionists determine which biblical passage to use as the basis for the Greater Israel Project?
The answer isn't straightforward, because originally they didn't. Theodor Herzl, the father of modern Zionism, wasn't particularly concerned about exact borders. Zionism at its origin was a largely secular, non-theological movement, more concerned with creating a safe haven from European anti-Semitism than with fulfilling biblical prophecy.
So how did modern Israel become what it is today, seeking to expand its territorial ambitions beyond its current borders?
In 1948, Israel declared independence and the State of Israel was formed. But it wasn't until June of 1967 that the seeds of the modern Greater Israel Project were planted.
What happened in 1967?
In a series of miscalculations and escalating tensions, war broke out between Israel and its neighbors. Israel launched a preemptive strike that in just 6 days captured land far beyond its 1948 borders. Specifically, the West Bank and Gaza Strip from Jordan and Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. The Sinai was later returned to Egypt under a 1979 peace treaty, but the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan remained. It was in the wake of that 6-day war, which religious nationalists interpreted as a miraculous act of divine intervention, that the modern Greater Israel Project began to take shape.
Where does Iran fit into all this?
The biggest threat to Israel's existence is Iran. Iran has called for the end of the State of Israel since 1979. And the historical record is clear. When Ayatollah Khomeini came to power, he declared America the Great Satan and Israel the Little Satan. His documented statements include, "We must all rise, destroy Israel, and replace it with the heroic Palestinian nation." And, "It is the duty of all Muslims to liberate Jerusalem and remove this nucleus of evil from Islamic lands."
I can see why Israel viewed Iran as a threat, but what would provoke Khomeini to issue such declarations in the first place? Iran and Israel had actually been close allies for 30 years before 1979. What happened?
To answer that honestly, we need to go back to 1953. The roots of Iranian hostility toward America, which then extended to Israel as America's closest regional partner, begin with a CIA-backed coup that the United States executed at the initiative of the United Kingdom.
Why did the United Kingdom want to overthrow an Iranian government?
Because Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, had nationalized the country's oil industry.
Nationalized? What does that mean?
It means Iran decided to take full ownership of its own natural resources. Up until 1951, Iranian oil had been controlled by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British corporation later known as British Petroleum, or BP. When Prime Minister Mossadegh came to power, he pushed through legislation to nationalize the oil fields, meaning Iran, not a British company, would control Iranian oil.
I see nothing wrong with that. A sovereign nation should control its own resources.
The United Kingdom did not see it that way. Nationalizing the oil fields meant a major British corporation would lose enormous profits, and Britain would lose imperial prestige and strategic influence. Britain initiated a covert operation, which the US then executed as Operation Ajax, to overthrow Mossadegh in 1953. The coup restored the Iranian monarchy, installing Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, who ruled for the next 26 years with American support.
So the United States and the UK overthrew a democratically elected leader to protect British oil profit.
Ironic, isn't it, that the US and UK, the shining lights of democracy, overthrowing a democracy? The Shah's modernization, land reform, infrastructure, women's suffrage brought real changes, but it came at a cost that went beyond economics. His white revolution was seen by millions of Iranians as a top-down imposition of Western values that bypassed Iranian culture, Islamic tradition, and religious authority entirely. Clerics were stripped of land. Universities promoted secular Western curricula. The Shah was seen not merely as corrupt and authoritarian, but as an agent of cultural erasure. Add to that a secret police that tortured thousands, rising inflation and income inequality. All these events culminated to what is described as the Iranian Revolution.
Revolution? When?
Major demonstrations began in January 1978 and paralyzed the country by year's end. The Shah fled in January 1979. Khomeini returned from 15 years of exile, and on April 1st, over 90% of Iranians voted to establish an Islamic republic. Khomeini became supreme leader by December.
Over 90%? That's virtually the entire country.
The ballot asked one question: are you in favor of an Islamic republic? Yes or no? No definition of what an Islamic republic meant. As for what followed, historian Ervand Abrahamian, a historian and author, documented that fewer than 100 political prisoners were executed under the Shah between 1971 and 1979. Between 1981 and 1985 alone, more than 7,900 were executed under Khomeini, primarily leftists, intellectuals, and secular opponents who had helped bring the revolution to power.
See? I told you they were a repressive government.
And here is where it all connects back to the Greater Israel Project. When Khomeini took power, he immediately severed Iran's 30-year alliance with Israel, transferred Israel's embassy in Tehran to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and made opposition to the Israeli state a founding pillar of the Islamic Republic. Since 1979, every supreme leader has maintained this position, embedding it in official state doctrine, state-sponsored education, and military programming. Iran's documented and consistent calls for Israel's elimination made it, over the following decades, the primary strategic obstacle to Israeli territorial expansion. The one regional power with the ideology, the resources, and eventually the proxy network to impose real costs on Israeli military action. Which brings us back to where we started.
Why was Khomeini so hostile against Israel?
Khomeini's hostility toward Israel was theological, political, and strategic, all simultaneously. Theologically, he viewed Israel as an illegitimate colonial imposition on Muslim land, writing as early as 1942 that Jews were perennial enemies of Islam, conspiring against Muslim society. But the hostility was also strategically useful. Anti-Zionism was the one cause that could unite Shia and Sunni, Persian and Arab, across the entire Muslim world, giving a Persian Shia cleric the tool he needed to claim leadership of all Muslims and frame every act of resistance against Israel as a sacred religious obligation.
Were US-Iran relations always this hostile since 1979?
No, and this is one of the most underreported stories of the post-9/11 era. Shortly after the September 11, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center, Iran condemned the attacks.
I was one of the first world leaders to condemn these barbaric and savage acts. As a human, as a Muslim, and as an Iranian, I stand before you to once again express my deepest sympathy with the families of the victims and with all the great American people. Let us wish for a world devoid of violence and anger, and instead blessed with compassion and peace.
Provided the United States with intelligence on al-Qaeda members crossing from Afghanistan, and was, in the words of James Dobbins, the Bush administration's chief negotiator on Afghanistan in late 2001, comprehensively helpful
in working to overthrow the Taliban and help install the Karzai government in Kabul. Iran extended a genuine hand to the United States at the moment of America's greatest vulnerability.
So what happened?
About 4 months later, President Bush named Iran, alongside Iraq and North Korea, as part of the Axis of Evil in his January 2002 State of the Union address.
Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
The hardliners in Tehran pointed to it as proof that engaging America was futile. A diplomatic opening that could have changed the trajectory of the last 2 decades was closed permanently.
Iran helped the US after 9/11 and was called part of the Axis of Evil in return? I had no idea.
I suppose it depends on where you get your news.
The motivation behind America's deeper involvement is complicated, but it appears that America's actions have been inextricably tied to Israel's strategic objectives. We know this because on the day of the initial US-Israeli strike against Iran in 2026, Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated publicly, "We knew that there was going to be an Israeli action. We knew that they would precipitate an attack against American forces, and we knew that if we didn't preemptively go after them before they launched those attacks, we would suffer higher casualties."
Imminent threat, and the imminent threat was that we knew that if Iran was attacked, and we believed they would be attacked, that they would immediately come after us. And we were not going to sit there and absorb a blow before we responded, because the Department of War assessed that if we did that, if we waited for them to hit us first after they were attacked, and by someone else, Israel attacked them, they hit us first, and we waited for them to hit us, we would suffer more casualties and more deaths. We went proactively in a defensive way to prevent them from inflicting higher damage.
So the United States had to attack Iran first, because Iran would have retaliated against an Israeli attack on Iran. Why didn't the US simply stop Israel from attacking in the first place?
Now do you see how the Greater Israel Project fits in? How could a country with the most powerful military in the world, the center of the global economy, not prevent a nation roughly the size of New Jersey from dragging it into a war? Why does Israel have such extraordinary influence over American foreign policy? These are the questions our series is going to answer.
This is all very interesting and frightening. We appear to be watching a world war disguised as a holy crusade, driven in significant part by a religious manuscript that almost nobody seems to truly understand, its context, its history, or its contradictions.
That discomfort is where the truth lives.
I do have one last thought before we go. If the current Greater Israel Project deviates from the Bible and far exceeds what Genesis 15 outlines as the land God had promised Abraham, what prevents Israel from expanding its borders beyond the Greater Israel Project? I mean, is there anything in the Bible that justifies such expansion?
In Psalms 2, verse 8, God declares,
"Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession."
I suppose this could justify Israel's global hegemony over the entire earth.
That is disturbing.
We hope you'll join us for future episodes, where we examine the forces that brought us here, from AIPAC to the evangelical movement, from the nuclear deal to the Kushner connection, and where we follow the evidence wherever it leads. Until next time.
Now we have come to the conclusion that America wants to turn Iran into another Syria or Iraq or Yemen and now or even Venezuela. They are going to do that one way or another. If we don't stand behind our government, if we don't take part in these celebrations, Americans will come after us sooner or later. They will come after us because they want to avenge what we have done to them over the past 40 years. And I am positive, I told you, I give you my guarantees that if America one day finds out that we are not ready to defend ourselves, it is going to attack us with help from Saudi Arabia and of course Israel. That is exactly what they have in mind, and they are going to do that. First they wanted to turn Iran into Syria, they couldn't. They went after Syria. They have now gone after Venezuela. They have divided that country and they openly want regime change there.
We understand.